Welcome to Health Talk. I'm your host, Dr. Brian Grieves, and today we're going to talk about something that's become of increasing concern to people recently, and that is the health effects, and more specifically the mental health effects of social media. And I was alerted more to this by a recent presentation to the Shawano Community Health Action Team when they did their plunge last month on social media, as they wanted to investigate what the potential harms are of social media on people, and especially young people. I think we've all heard that rates of anxiety and depression went up among youth, especially post-COVID and recently. And so we had a guest speaker that day, Dr. Minich, who is a postdoctoral research associate in the Department of Pediatrics at UW-Madison. And he had some really interesting research that he's working on at UW-Madison and is very well versed in this topic. So I thought it would be great if we could have him help share some of that information at a broader level here by joining us on the show here today. So, Dr. Minich, welcome to Health Talk.
Hi, thanks. Great to be here.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. And if maybe let's just kind of start out by talking about, social media in general and what it seems like the narrative is. It's something that's really come out of the blue the last 10 or 15 years, I think, and become fairly ubiquitous right alongside smartphones. And it seems like there's perhaps a fair amount of concern around social media and the impact it might be having on people. Do you think that's fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. It's obviously an area of big public concern, right? It gets a lot of media coverage lately, and then I'm sure you've followed the case by the state attorneys general against, I believe it's Meta only, and then the Surgeon General's advisory, I think a month ago, about the effects of social media and youth mental health. There's been a lot of conversation about it, and I think there's understandably some concern, but there's still a lot that we don't know.
Okay. And so can you tell us, for those of us who may not have caught the Surgeon General's report, what the gist of the report was, and maybe the media reporting on that as well?
So the Surgeon General's advisory was actually pretty tempered, really only saying that it's not yet clear what the evidence suggests in terms of the impact of social media on youth mental health, but that this is something that really demands more attention. But of course, when the Surgeon General puts out an advisory about something, I think for a lot of folks, and certainly this was echoed in the media that I consumed about it, it really brings back memories of tobacco. I think a lot of people associate the Surgeon General warnings with tobacco warnings, and I think it sort of got covered in that way, right? As in, there's this really clear association with these harms, and we need to avoid this product. And that's just not really the content of the advisory. It's much more, we're aware that we have this youth mental health problem in this country, and the effects of social media are something that is urgent that we investigate more.
Sure. And in the youth, the concern really is that the increased use of social media has contributed to detriments in mental health, right? Specifically, probably anxiety and depression rates in youth and teenagers especially.
Yeah, that's the thinking. That's certainly the idea that's been proposed by some people. And I think it's important to note that it's not just diagnosis of depression and anxiety that's increased in adolescents over the last decade or so. I think if that was all that you saw, it'd be conceivable that that's a diagnostic thing, and that people are just becoming more aware of these conditions, or diagnostic criteria are changing, and so the rates are going up. But there's also been an increase in suicide and hospitalizations for self-harm. And so those are really tangible outcomes of mental health concerns. And that makes it clear that there's something going on with youth mental health. And so there's been a thinking that this sort of started around the time that smartphones became more pervasive and that social media use among adolescents became sort of ubiquitous. But it's not clear that there's actually a causal connection there. And I think it's important to be cautious about making those claims because this happens a lot with new media products. There's often a sort of moral panic about the damage that they're doing to our youth, and we want to be careful that we're not painting the wrong narrative. So what the Surgeon General has suggested is really that we focus more on meta-analysis and systematic literature reviews and do a better job of really finding out what the literature says consistently.
Interesting. So has that meta-analysis been done to understand what the literature says consistently at this point?
So there have been a number of meta-analyses here, and every meta-analysis that I've reviewed in this area in systematic review, and then Betty Dockenford did a great umbrella review, which is sort of a systematic review of meta-analyses and systematic reviews recently, has struggled to find really consistent effects or really consistent connections even between just social media use and mental health problems in adolescents, which is to say that there's not a lot of evidence when you look across the literature that more screen time or more social media use necessarily equates to worse mental health outcomes. It seems like whatever associations are there are more complex and more nuanced than just that sort of dose-response relationship.
Interesting. So do they have people come up with any alternative explanations for the the increase in suicide attempts and suicides and hospitalizations for mental health outcomes that you said we've seen in the last 10 to 15 years?
I don't know. And
Sure.
I'm really hesitant to suggest an alternative explanation for that because it's not my area.
Yeah, no, fair. I was just curious, as we're talking about that, right? But it's obviously one of the first rules in research is that correlation does not equal causation, and just because it's increased
Right.
at the same time that we started using iPhones and social media, that's automatically been the cause of the increase in mental health issues and concerns. One of the things that I found interesting that you said in the research that is out there was there's a relationship with parents' use of social media in mental health in their children. Can you talk a little bit about that relationship?
Yeah, so that's something that we found in our lab. We did a big survey of parent-adolescent dyads, basically, just where we talked to a parent and we talked to a child, and we asked a bunch of questions about their social media use and about the adolescents' mental health outcomes. And we found that there were sort of two groups. One where there was not necessarily low social media use, not necessarily low technology use by the adolescent, but not a lot of poor mental health outcomes. And in those cases, there were restrictions on use in the home, and there were lower levels of parental social media use. And the second group, which had higher or had worse mental health outcomes in the adolescents that sort of fell into that group, one of the defining characteristics of that group was higher parental social media use. And there is some other evidence that really high social media use by parents is associated with worse parent-child relationships. And it's early to really make a claim that it's what I want to be hesitant to do, or what I'm really hesitant to do, is say that parent social media use directly causes negative mental health outcomes in adolescents, because I think that's probably a bit too bold, and because I want to be really careful not to shame parents for using their phones, right? I think parents get it from all sides already, and it's not necessarily the case that using social media is bad for your child if you're a parent. Certainly there's also evidence that parents use social media to connect about parenthood and to discuss issues that their children and adolescent children are having, and that can really benefit their parenting. But there is an association there, right? And what that suggests is that it's a little bit more complicated than just the direct effect of social media on sort of the adolescent brain. There's some way that social media use is displacing or otherwise affecting these relationships that parents have with their kids and that kids have with each other.
Yeah. Interesting. So when we need to take a short break, and then when we come back, I want to talk a little bit about one of the really interesting ways you framed it for our presentation, which was some of the benefits and some of the harms that come from social media, and just kind of acknowledging both sides of the coin there. So we'll take a short break, and we'll be back with Dr. Minich after the break. Welcome back to HealthTalk. I'm your host, Dr. Brian Grieves, and today we're talking with Dr. Matt Minich, postdoctoral research associate in the Department of Pediatrics at UW-Madison, where he does research on social media and the impacts of social media on our mental health and on teenage brains. Dr. Minich, before the break, we were talking a little bit about some of the associations between both parental and child use of social media, and also, just to kind of give a balanced perspective on it and acknowledge that there are some both benefits and harms of social media. Can you first maybe speak to what are the benefits of using social media? Because that maybe doesn't get a lot of attention in popular media. We kind of feels like, as you said before the break, sometimes get shamed for being on social media.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important to note that social media can have a lot of benefits for adolescents, just as it can have a lot of benefits for adults, right? There's a reason that so many of us use social media and that people are drawn to social media. And it's not just that it's a vice that's addictive and that sort of depletes us. It obviously feeds some social needs, and that's true for adolescents too. So it obviously facilitates social connection, right, and learning. Adolescents are exposed to new content, and they have a new forum that they can connect with their friends on. There's also a thinking that the use of social media and the use of smartphones helps adolescents fulfill some of their developmental needs. So this is a time in people's lives, adolescents, when really the work that's being done, the work that adolescents need to do, is achieving social independence, is developing romantic and sort of friendly relationships outside of those that are controlled by their parents, and testing out and developing their own social identities. And social media gives them an area in which they can do this. And it makes it pretty easy for them to do, even when they're not necessarily in school or at a friend's house. So that can be a really positive thing. And it can also be really positive for adolescents who don't necessarily feel like they have a solid social place in their in-person environment, right? So that's long been the case online, on social media, and in forums. For members of the LGBTQ community, have found camaraderie and have found sort of information about their life experience that they might not have otherwise gotten from the communities that they're in day-to-day in person.
Yeah, very, very important things, right? And I imagine especially during the pandemic, some of those benefits became highlighted for kids when they weren't able to go to school for a period of time and get that connection or interaction with peers.
That's absolutely right. And I think that the pandemic is one of those weird cases where it's hard to say what's going on. And I think it's really important to know what's going on, because adolescent mental health outcomes really took a hit during the pandemic, and screen time went way up. And so it's sort of, I think, tempting to say, well, they spent more time on social media during the pandemic, and look what it's done, right? Look at the negative outcome. But obviously, the pandemic was a stressful time for all of us, and especially for adolescents who were removed from school and other opportunities they had to socialize with each other. So it's quite possible, and adolescents have told us, that the use of social media really served as sort of a balm for the stress and the anxiety that isolation produced. And so it's quite possible that the screen time in that case was more helpful than harmful, but we don't know for sure.
Sure. And what about since the pandemic? Is it I shouldn't necessarily say but since the height of it, do we have any data that you're aware of that social media use has gone back down at all, and have adolescent mental health improved at all as the pandemic has somewhat fallen to the wayside, or is it too early to know that information yet?
I'll say it's too early for me personally to know. I don't know. And I haven't seen a lot of numbers about that, or about like very recent reports of outcomes. I know that through conversations with adolescents in our youth advisory boards and in focus groups that we've conducted in the lab, adolescents have said that their screen time and their social media time has normalized now that they're back in school. Right? They've all described this during the pandemic. I was on my phone constantly, and it seems like now that's been reduced a little. Whether or not that's been followed with improved mental health outcomes, I honestly don't know.
Sure. And then let's move on to talking about what do we know about the harms of social media, or the risks, I guess. Sure. Maybe whether harms, risks, whatever is a better term for that.
Sure. So I'm always trying to, and I did in my presentation where we met, and then I try to do this in my work too, be really tempered about the negative effects, because I'm hesitant to contribute to what I think is a popular narrative that wrongly paints social media as really harmful. But that doesn't mean that there aren't harms associated with social media use for some adolescents, right? There's obviously some acute negative effects that can happen. So social comparison for adolescents and for adults is associated with lots of negative outcomes, right? For poor mental health, poor perceived well-being, just reduced mood. And social comparison is facilitated by social media. So adolescents who engage in a lot of social comparison, they do feel worse. FOMO is a real thing. FOMO is the fear of missing out. And we actually have FOMO scales where we assess that as an outcome of social media use. And certainly for some kids who use social media in a certain way, FOMO is a real thing. And it causes them real harm. And so I think the fact that sometimes it just makes you feel that is important to consider. It doesn't have to cause depression to be a problem. There's also wasted time, right? So there's a displacement hypothesis that is not always borne out, but the idea that just the time that's spent scrolling, just the time that's spent on the phone, displaces in-person relationships, displaces enriching activities like practicing an instrument or playing sports or reading a book, and that's causing some kind of harm. And I think that with really high levels of use, there is evidence for that. Adolescents can be exposed to negative and disturbing content on social media, of course, right? And one thing that is a real concern, as I think is always a parent's concern, is initiation of substance use. So adolescents have always, when it comes to substance use behaviors, been influenced by their peers and by the media. Social media creates this weird mix of the two, where it serves as sort of a super peer, right? They're getting the kind of norm information from social media that they would normally get from just regular media, from television, telling them that these behaviors exist. Here's how they're practiced. Here's how normal they are. But they're also seeing that in the context of their peers. So if they're being exposed to a lot of substance use content, if they have them in their peer group, social media can make that a little bit more accessible to them. And then, of course, the thing that we hear adolescents being most worried about is bullying, right? Adolescents can be mean to each other, and social media provides an outlet for that. And I think that's harmful, however it happens.
Sure. Yeah. No. All good considerations with that. So we're getting a little bit short on time. So what we're going to do is take a short break, and then when we come back, I'm gonna ask you maybe what you feel like the take home message is for parents and people out there right now in regards to social media, and how to use it hopefully in helpful ways or healthy ways for our mental health. So we'll take a short break and be right back with Dr. Minich. Welcome back to Health Minich at the UW-Madison Pediatrics Department, researcher and on social media use. And Dr. Minich, we've been talking a lot today about some of the possible risks and benefits of social media use, and kind of looking at examining the nuances of this issue, because it's maybe not as straightforward as it's sometimes made out to be in popular media. So that said, as difficult as this might be to do, could you kind of just leave our listeners with what you feel like the take-home message or points might be in regards to what we know about social media to this point and its effects on our health?
Yeah, I think what I'd like to do, if I could do anything, and a lot is not known, and so I don't want to paint anything with too broad of a brush here, but I'd like parents to set themselves at ease a little bit that mere exposure to social media is not necessarily toxic. And so if your adolescent is using social media, if your adolescent is enthusiastic about social media, that is not necessarily poisonous for their mental health, and it's not necessarily something that you or they should be ashamed of or try to fix. There are patterns of social media use that can be harmful. So passive use, where adolescents are just scrolling, can be harmful, especially if it's causing them to compare themselves to others. And if they're on social media and they have a harmful social environment, they're being bullied or they don't fit in the group that they have, that can be harmful. But I would say trust your gut, know your adolescent, find out how they're feeling and what their experience is, and don't necessarily assume that just being on Instagram or TikTok is causing them harm in and of itself.
Perfect. I think that's a really good stance to take right now based on what you've said we know about social media. So I want to thank you very much again for taking time out of your schedule to help us better understand social media and the implications of its use as we deal with the new development. You know, like you said before, we've always perhaps been had some trepidation around new technology and TV when that came on, you know, in our generation was widely used. And so this definitely helps shed some insight into that area. So thanks again for joining us, and hopefully you'll come back in the future and keep us updated on research as it evolves in this area.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. It's been really fun.
Likewise. Until next week, this has been Dr. Brian Grieves for HealthTalk.